Anyway, so I'm sure Ben will find out that we approved his suggestion because he was bugging me already on it. All right, so then do you want to do this first here? Because I think this is probably faster than whatever the platform guards are going to be, because last time it took us an hour and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I could see this being done in 20 minutes or in an hour, depending on how deep we go.
Are those the only two we have left?
From the blocking ones, I believe, yes, unless somebody marked them yesterday.
Okay.
Because I was checking yesterday, and I think the only person that picked me was Corey, and he marked his as blocking, so it should be the only 3 ones that we have.
I imagine the platform checks are going to take a while, so
yeah, I think so too.
If we're going to do this one, we should do it first.
So
Okay.
then, yeah.
Jeff, do you want to speak to this one?
Sure. So we need there's basically two goals here. One is we want to define for the new APIs we've defined in system.net.connections. We want to define what exceptions are expected from these things. Is it just IO exception? That's probably what most folks are. The limited implementations we have today are probably throwing IO exception, but we want to at least have some, basic guidance about what exceptions these APIs like listen async and connect async should throw. Two, and of course, as part of that discussion, we may also want to define some, much like socket error on socket exception today, we may want to define some specific error conditions via an enum or something like that will allow users to distinguish between different kinds of failures that can happen when they're doing listen or connect or accept. The specific requirement also that we have from ASP.NET here is that ASP.NET in the code that they're using today does, via socket exception, detect 3 particular socket error conditions and handle, I don't think it does much in terms of actually handling them itself, but it at least does stuff to report them to the user in terms of mapping it to their own exceptions. Those 3 specific error cases are address in use, which is surfaced from basically a listen operation, and then connection reset and connection abort, which are connection aborted, which are surfaced via stream.read and write, or async or not. So at the very least, we need to define some sort of way to distinguish those conditions that is generic and not specific to sockets. That does raise, well, that kind of leads to the next issue here, which is there's kind of 2 sets of APIs that we're talking about here. There are these brand new connection APIs, right? There's connection factory, connection listener factory, connection, and there's stuff like connect async, listen async, accept async. These are all brand new APIs, so we are free to define whatever kind of exception semantics we want here. New exceptions, old exceptions, new enums, whatever. Then the other case is is exposing connection aborted and connection reset from stream.read and write. These are obviously existing APIs. They throw IO exception today. So we want whatever we're going to use here in the future needs to be an IO exception or a derivative thereof, but with some extra piece of information about how to distinguish the particular cases of aborted and reset. So we've got 3 options here that we put together, which I will call the 2 exception, or the add 2 exceptions case, the add 1 exception case, and the add no exceptions case. And that's in order A, B, C here. So option A is the 2 exceptions case. We add a new connection exception specifically for the system.net.connections APIs. It lives in system.net.connections, as you'd expect. And it has a connection error on it, which is something of a simplification of the kinds of errors that you get back from sockets when doing operations like connect, listen, and accept. And the idea would be that anybody implementing that, including the sockets factory here, would set the connection error when they throw an exception, and if somebody wants to do something with that, they can do it. The particular enum values are just, as I said, kind of just a basic sort of simplification of the socket error ones. These seemed like the ones that were most useful and most interesting to users without, going into the nitty-gritty of the differences between socket error, address family not supported, and address not available, and stuff like that. And then, okay, so continuing with option A, for the stream exceptions for stream read and write, we would define a new exception type, which we've called network exception here, that just basically derives from IO exception as it needs to, and it adds a network error property here, which we've just defined 2 values for, boarded and reset. We don't love the name network exception. The trick here is that these exceptions make sense for a class of streams that are basically connection-oriented streams, but they don't necessarily make sense for non-connection oriented or random access streams like file stream or memory stream, where it doesn't really, like, the connection itself isn't aborted, the file may be closed or disposed or something like that, but it doesn't have the same kind of semantics of a connection reset or connection abort. But there are other types of streams, like quick streams, or maybe layered streams like SSL stream that's sitting on top of a network stream underneath, that we that might want to expose this added error information so that a consumer can do something with it. So that's option A. Option B, if you can scroll down, is, as I said, the one exception case where what we basically did is we said, well, we want to have a new exception here, and we want to have a new enum for the error codes, but we'll just use one. We'll define it in system.io, and the connections API can use this too, as well as stream.readWrite, and anybody else who wants to use it, of course. And then the enum just basically captures all the possible interesting enumerated errors that we have here. Connection API would presumably throw exceptions with those first 4 because they are about listening and accepting and connecting and stuff like that. Whereas stream.read or network stream.read and write would throw stuff like aborted or reset. And then option C is very similar to that. You want to scroll down. Except this is the no new exception option. This is saying, well, we need an enum, but hey, let's just add it to IO exception. And yes, this set of particular IO errors don't necessarily apply to all the scenarios in which IO exception is used, but that's okay. They don't need to use it. Additionally, in the future, if we wanted to add more values to this enumeration that do apply to file stream or some other stream like that, we could add more values to the enum and perhaps make users' lives easier by distinguishing some of those error conditions. The one last thing to say, I think, before we kind of have a discussion about this is, as there were some comments in here from like Jan and Dan about how the whole question of how we surface particular error conditions is really a broader discussion across the framework. Jan linked to an issue about how to do this, I think, with file stream in particular. But certainly it doesn't seem like we do a whole lot of this kind of distinguishing particular error cases in general today, at least not with IO exception. And B, we probably ought to think broadly about if we want to do more of that, and if we're going to do it, how we want to do it in terms of enumeration values, derived exceptions, and what kind of guidance we want to give for people using those things. So So that's the order.
From a guidelines perspective, the soft status we have is if someone is going to handle the condition differently, it should be a different type of exception. Basically, the statement caption type should say everything that you need to say. There shouldn't need to be whatever the win statement is, or you shouldn't need to inspect it internally. So, but that's mostly an anecdote by Christoph and not anything that we've codified in a specific rule.
Yeah, and so that would argue for going even further in terms of creating new exceptions here. Like we could imagine having a, connection aborted exception that derives from IO exception, and we throw that from stream read and write, and we'd have another that's the connection reset exception that we throw that derives from IO exception, and we throw from stream read and write. And we might have a small handful of connection exceptions where at least one general purpose one and one specific one that derives from address and use, derives from the base for address and use, so that we can distinguish that case particularly. That is in fact what ASP.NET does internally today. For the 3 cases they care about here, they have specific exception types defined that are specific to ASP.NET. If that's the guidance, I don't have a strong preference here. I think from a networking point of view, we're kind of just looking for what's the general guidance and how do we satisfy the requirements that we've got here to distinguish at least at least those 3 and possibly a few more, since we're already doing this.
I mean, certainly, I think if this was bit banging all the way down to the NIC itself, and there was no system p-invoke type stuff involved, then the answer would be easy. It's different problem. A problem that should be handled differently should be a different type of exception. Once it's we're wrapping native layers, now you get to decide, is it better to transparently return them, which is a problem for the user? Should we try normalizing them across OSs into something like an enum, at which point we could have done different exception types, etc. But like the big general notion is, if you would handle it in a different way, it should be represented by a different type. And anything that's extra data properties and stuff are things that should generally only be useful in logging and not in recovery. That's the sort of starting position, and then nuance moves off of that position in every direction you can imagine.
So these were kind of modeled after the current socket exception, which returns a socket error. And it has been useful to have an error code there just because of typically, you can actually see in the example here, typically if you're handling socket errors, you're kind of catching a whole bag of them that are all similar-ish. But we've already kind of consolidated them here, so maybe having separate exception types would be better.
Yeah, I mean, like a single exception with an enum suggests a hierarchy to me. Like that, I mean, that would be the alternative. Is that you do have, like socket. If we take socket, the socket exception, then address and use exception extends socket exception, and etc. Of why did we fail to work with the socket? And then if socket exception is an IO exception, then you're just like, what, any IO goes wrong, we're just going to say we couldn't do the stuff, but we'll retry the whole operation. And so it's about thinking not about what the problem is, but what the recovery is. And that's what's supposed to design how the exception is shaped. If you think that there's going to be a grab bag, or like 4 things that people will handle, but like 12 different errors that are worth logging differently, then maybe that's that you do the base class, which has the enum, but then you, for types that you expect people to handle, you make derived types. And yes, the derived type only has the one code ever represented in it. But what you've said is, this is the, connection refused exception, and that's a thing that someone's going to handle differently in their code than address in use and things like that. I mean, that's again the place to start the thought process.
I mean, given that guidance, it seems clear to me that looking at the aborted and reset cases in particular, that those should have their own derived exception types. We should define connection aborted exception that derives from IO exception and connection reset exception that derives from IO exception. We'll modify network stream and any other streams that we want to throw those, and because they derive from IO exception, that's backward compatible. And we'll tell anyone who wants to detect those particular cases, including ASP.NET, hey, there's these new exceptions, you can handle them. And we'll tell anybody who's implementing streams that wants to expose those, hey, there's these new exceptions, you can throw them if you want to, and allow customers to catch it as opposed to just throwing a generic IO exception.
And to be clear on that, aborted is handled distinctly from other IO, and reset is handled distinctly from other IO and distinctly from aborted. So aborted and reset are two different special problems?
Yeah, aborted. So yeah, this is worth discussing. Aborted mean, well, okay, let's start with reset. You establish a connection, you start reading and writing. Reset means that your peer, the guy on the other end, decided to kill the connection. They said, we don't want to do this anymore. We're sending you a reset. And so you're going to start getting errors from your read and write operations that say the connection was reset by the peer. That's a very useful condition to be able to handle.
So active termination by the remote party.
Exactly.
Okay.
Aborted means it was aborted locally. In other words, your code decided that it wasn't interested in this connection anymore, maybe something timed out or something like that, and it decided to go close the connection, dispose the stream, whatever, and or shut down the stream. And any pending or subsequent read or write operations that you have will get the connection aborted exception, which again is useful to distinguish because that's much different than like, it's not that something failed with the connection, it's that you yourself decided to kill it, and now operations on it are simply going to give you back this aborted condition.
All right, those sound different to me.
Yeah. So yeah.
If we have consensus that these should all be split up, then I think we can. If everyone is comfortable, we can say we're going to define an address and use exception and so on going down this list. Otherwise, we can come back to review on Thursday.
I mean, that's the thing I would caution against too, is because if you go all the way, then you end up with effectively one exception per enum member, which seems over the board as well. Like, I think what I would do is I would, as Jeremy suggested, like, come up with a hierarchy of things that you think are very likely for people to handle. So I'm not a fan of munching everything in IO exception because that would be too much. But similarly, I think having one exception per enum member also seems over the top because that's an ever-growing list. But the nice thing is, if you have a base type that is reasonable, like, I don't know, a connection error or networking exception, for example, then it's totally reasonable for us to define more derived types in the future. So, for example, if you say, today we expose address in use only as an enum member on network exception, but it's so common that people would like just catch the exception directly, we can totally have a new exception type, address in use network exception, that derives from network exception because it won't break any of the existing code. It just means that if you throw that instance and you query the network error property, it better still says address in use. But like, you can basically, this way you can make it a little bit more future proof, in the sense that if in V1 you only have a few error cases you really care about and basically none of them require extra state, then you get away with few exceptions. And if in the future you have to extend the exception types because they could carry more custom state, or they're just so prominent that people want to write custom catch handlers for them, then you can add them on demand as well. And we have done this in the past as well with COM exceptions, but I think by and large, like, we don't want to end up with Win32 where we have one exception per error code, but at the same time we don't want to end up in Win32 where we have one giant table with error codes, right? So the truth is somewhere in the middle, and it's unfortunately an opinionated take on that. So it's hard for me to say, like, make these exception types. But like, as Jeremy suggested, I think the key scenario is, what are the error codes that are most commonly handled by user code? And make sure you have corresponding exception types. Nobody wants to write catch generic exception name and then a giant when clause, right? That's not discoverable.
Yeah, and I would go further and say that, like, if we're going to call it, network exception and network error, that you possibly want to have or add a factory method on the exception type. So people, whether it's your library or any other library, say that they're just creating a network exception for address and use. And if we didn't initially have an address and use exception and we add it in a later version, the factory can change to throwing the most derived type. Granted, somebody, if the constructor is public, could still do it wrong, but it will mean that anybody who had the filter in place on the base, or what then became the base class, will still work, and then they'll get the derived type in any version that it's available. And that, I think, is a good path forward for taking something from an enum into a specific exception so that catch handlers are cleaner.
That makes sense, I think. Given that guidance, then I think for the connection APIs, we just define like a new connection exception that derives from IO exception, I guess. We wouldn't even have an enum because the only specific condition that we know that any of our customers need to detect today is simply address and use. So I think we just define a general purpose connection exception that doesn't even have an enum, just has text that describes what went wrong for logging purposes. And then we'd have one specific derived exception from that is address and use. And then, as you mentioned, we can add factory methods on the exception itself for particular conditions so that they have, so that it's future proof and so that they have, standard text that they use. But I don't think we'd actually don't think we define derived exception types for stuff like invalid address or connection refused until we decided that there was a specific use case for doing that. And especially since it's late in the game and we don't want to be inventing a whole bunch of stuff here that we feel like we're going to commit to long term. Does that make sense?
It does.
So you're saying we have some sort of exception type with this enum basically as it stands today, but we only create the derived exception types for connection aborted and connection reset?
No, I'd say don't even have the enum, right? I mean, the guidance I'm hearing in general is enums on exceptions are not super useful.
Well,
They're
it
useful for
sounded like
logging.
Emo was proposing a hybrid of having both enums and a derived exception types. I think that at the minimum, a distinction between connection refused and host not found is important here.
Okay.
I mean, the reason why I think having an error property is useful is in the same reason why we have it in other places already, right? Socket exception has it, SQL exception has it, and it's basically when you have a long tally of error codes that, you don't want to hide information from the user and you want people to be able to switch on them if necessary. But I see it as an escape hatch, right? It's more like let's avoid thousands of exception types, but at the same time, mainline code that people are very likely to write should not require that.
Yeah, and Socket in particular is dealing with a pre-existing native API that defines a bunch of error codes that we, for the most part, wanted to directly service to the user because we don't want to hide information about what the OS is telling us as far as what's going on with the socket. So we basically just took the native list and said, socket error equals these, 23 error codes or whatever. In this case, we have an opportunity to define exactly what it's an abstract API already, right? It's general purpose. It's meant to not be tied to a specific API like sockets. So we can determine exactly what error conditions we want to surface, whether that's 4 or 40. And I think it's probably a lot closer to 4 than 40.
Yeah. But yeah, basically the what's on the screen modulo naming of, like, if it's reasonable to say, host not found, which I assume it means a DNS resolution error and check the entry that you typed, versus connection refused, they're not listening, etc. Like those are things that an application could handle differently to tell a user to something different is going on,
Right.
and that maybe a library would also handle differently for what its recovery actions would be. Is it a wait and try again, or is it a like maybe the internet didn't exist?
Right.
But that maybe they're not common enough that they're all worth distinct exception cases right now. So yeah, I would go the hybrid model. So do define the enum now and the exception, because otherwise what would your factory method take? Because you want to be able to say, give me the correct network exception or connection exception or whatever for error, address, and use.
Well, you don't need an enum to do the factory method, though. You could just create n factory methods, right? If there's 4 conditions you want to expose, just
Well, but how do you represent them?
different methods. Create address and use exception, create invalid address exception.
Fair enough. Factory methods instead of factory method, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah. But then if you're going to have the connection refused exception, or sorry, the create connection refused exception as a method, and it's just returning connection exception, then is that just in the text that somebody finds out what went wrong? Like, as Emo said with the SQL exception and stuff, sometimes for advanced cases, people will want to switch off the error property. It's just that shouldn't be your mainline design. It should be the advanced design.
Yeah, the only other sorry, the only other problem that you also have when you have these long error lists is like you have to decide what the error code is, right? So in your case, you decided on an enum, which now has this problem of how do you map the native API to that list, and can you do this sufficiently in all cases, right? If you decide on an exception hierarchy that is, a small set of exceptions, it might not be too bad. But if you have an error list with like 30 items eventually, then the question is, how do you do this across operating systems when different operating systems have, some may have 3 error codes where the other one only has a single error code for all 3 cases. And that might get also problematic. But in SQL, it kind of works because the error codes are maintained by one entity, and there's an unambiguous one-to-one correspondence. Same with Win32, but like for abstractions, error codes are certainly also problematic if the desire is to expose the underlying thing truthfully, right? In which case, you might be better just saying, it's an int, and then, sorry, dude, like you have to read the manual on what POSIX or Win32 gives you as an error code here.
And there's always in all these cases there'll be an inner exception, or in any useful case where there's additional information from the underlying provider like sockets, there'll be an inner exception that says socket error not already in use, right?
Gotcha.
Or socket error connection refused. And so the value of these is not necessarily that we're giving a user information that they aren't going to get otherwise.
Right.
And probably in a better and more useful way. The value of these is to have a common way to represent these conditions across different providers.
Right, but again, that comes back to like if I don't know that connection refused makes sense in anything other than a socket, but if it does, like the notion that you want to handle, hey, the other side actively rejected the request, to surface that differently in an application, then you don't want someone to have to sniff the inner exception to find, oh, it was a socket exception and the socket error was connection refused, because anytime that you need to, essentially, if your catch looks at inner exception, someone has failed.
Totally. I wasn't saying that. I was saying, I didn't mean to imply that that your catch should be looking at the inner exception. I'm simply saying that if this is for logging and diagnostic purposes, the information will be there, right, in the inner exception. If you're making a programmatic decision trying to catch particular conditions, then yeah, I agree that if we want to enable that, we need to do either an enum or a derived type here. And I'm still just kind of struggling a little bit to understand what the guidance is as far as whether we should just do derived types here or whether we should just do enums, and to what extent we should worry about exposing these today versus limiting what we expose today and keeping it open in the future to define more conditions that people might care about.
In terms of what people care about, I think an enum would probably be okay for most of these. The aborted exception would probably be the most commonly caught.
Yeah, I think for aborted and reset, we definitely want derived exceptions, right?
Yeah, the other ones I would be fine saying keep those in an enum for now. We can expose additional exception types later if we need to.
Yeah, I mean, presumably they'll all be in the enum. Just the like looking at your grouping right now, it's the 4 in the middle you're saying would not have a public derived type yet, and the 2 at the bottom would each get their own type in addition to being represented in the enum because they need to set something on the base class property.
Yes, and additionally, address in use would have its own derived type because we needed it. Well, I guess if it's on the enum, then we don't need that.
Right. It's all about do you think that it's a common thing for someone to want to handle differently than the other kinds of error? If they're all going to be lumped together in something went wrong, then you don't need a derived type. If it's, oh, address was in use, I should increment my port number and try again, then that's a different, and that's a common thing, then you would totally do it.
Yeah, all of these are things that people would take an action on, but I don't think the middle 4 are common enough for people to care about distinguishing to need an additional type.
Yeah, because again, like I can see an application saying, "Oh, host not found." That's like highlight the box in red of like you typed gibberish here, but that the average library is just going to look at all of these and either have a common retry of the networking stuff didn't work, or never look at it at all and just let it throw through. And so that's where you have to decide the balance is how common is someone going to handle the error. But yeah, so I would say sort of start with this, and then anything that you expect someone to catch, or if it's that ASP.NET is handling those 3 things already, that's basically your data set of which 3 of these need a derived type in addition to being represented in the enum.
Yep, makes sense. All right, I think we have the guidance we need. Corey, anything else? Otherwise, we will go revise this and come back Thursday. Sound good?
One thing that Jeff and I couldn't quite reach agreement on here was between option A and B of having kind of separating the stream errors from the connect errors, or kind of grouping them all into one big network exception class. Any opinions there, and if we should keep just one base class or have 2?
Well, so I guess like we did decide for I think we did decide that we need derived exception types for aborted and reset. We'll have a connection aborted exception and a connection reset exception. So then the question becomes, do those types derive from network error,
network
or do they just derive from IO exception? My personal take is they should just derive from IO exception because those 2 are the ones that affect stream APIs and are somewhat separate from the other ones that are really about the connection APIs. So if we have a network exception or a connection exception or whatever we're going to call it that defines the exceptions that come from the connection APIs, and it's got an enum that defines particular cases.
Well, but connection aborted would theoretically also apply out of, because aborted and reset are once things are going, right? And I guess these others are only about establishment.
Yes.
Yeah,
well,
so
aborted could happen if you're doing an accept and you dispose the socket.
Okay,
so
or
if
if you're a multiple handshake establishment protocol, like you're both streaming and establishing already.
Yeah,
I don't know that
imagine scenarios like SSL, right, where you create a you create a TCP connection and then you do the SSL handshake over it, and you can imagine that the TCP connection succeeds, but during the SSL handshake, the peer resets the TCP connection, and therefore causes the SSL connection itself to fail to complete the connection process. Now, it's not clear to me that you want to expose that as an aborted error so much as you want to expose it as like a, connection refused with an inner exception that says, the handshake, the TCP connection itself was aborted.
Yeah, I'd probably go with everything that feels like a networking problem just being network exception extends IO exception, and then subset off that. I don't know that I'd make weird peers to network exception for networking problems. Again, just using the name that's here. So if that's the distinction between A and B, because I was looking for the rules when we scrolled past A. I think that I like what's on screen now, plus creating the derived types off of this for specific errors.
Yeah. The reason, just to explain option A a bit, the reason, the logic behind option A is these are the conditions that apply to using the connection APIs, and so you ought to have something. If we're defining an exception model for this, it would seem to make sense to have something like connection exception that defines the set of exceptions that are exposed from connection APIs. I'm not sure that we think that set of conditions really has any applicability beyond the connection APIs.
Right.
It could.
I mean, so the distinction isn't, we don't care who throws a thing, we care what you do when you catch. And so if that's a thing that can, connection aborted can pop out of stream.read or network stream.read, then that's not really a connect problem because you may not understand you're connecting. And so I think it would be easier for documentation to just be like throws network exception if some weird networking problem goes wrong, right? Like, and then see the details of the specific exception for what actually went wrong. So I would just go with one network exception type and then all the networking exceptions that we feel like making a distinction go from that. I wouldn't put any peers to it.
Okay, but we're still doing derived types for aborted and reset then? Because we think that...
Because you think people will handle catching them distinctly.
Yes.
Well,
But they would derive from network exception instead of IO exception.
Right. So existing catch handlers still work because you were catching IO exception for this case, and now you can just write a more specific one without using filters.
Okay.
So I wrote up some notes. So what are the
I think we're basically landing on option B then. That even though we spent a lot of time talking about derived exceptions, we're basically going to end up with an enum and maybe derived exceptions for aborted and reset if we think those are useful enough.
I think that seems reasonable. Like I would avoid the merging with IO exception because that will become otherwise a massive dumping ground over time.
Yeah, we had kind of the same feeling.
I mean, I understand what Jan was pointing out, but I'd rather solve it for IO differently. Because, I mean, IO is virtually everything where errors can occur, right? So that's not a very useful differentiator, probably.
Given that, can we just approve option B today?
I mean, I think you want to take what B looks like plus add some factories to it so that you can, if you have a factory method that takes network error, if right now invalid address just is return new network exception, build format with invalid address, and later you've decided that invalid address was worthy of its own exception type, that you have that choke point that says you were trying to represent an invalid address error. We've made a more derived type. This helps with catching in the future. So I think you'd want B plus a factory or parallel factories.
And in the factory model, is the constructor not public? You have to use the factory?
I mean, that's up to you. Generally, it's nice if there's only one way to build a thing, but I think for an exception, it's probably less of an issue than with utility types where we're confusing people between public constructors and public factories.
Well, One
It seems to me
benefit
that-
we said of having a factory is that in the future we could say we're going to throw the new derived exception type. So I think it'd be better to just prevent users from making the error of not throwing the derived exception type and only have a factory.
I mean, I would say, like, to me, the factory is more important for your own code internally, because realistically, the servicing boundary or the compat boundary is for the framework, right? That we, are consistent with what we throw, right? If somebody else throws exceptions, I don't think it's that important that they're consistent with the rest of the stack, because it's dedicated areas anyway, right? So like yes, it would be nice if everybody would be consistent here, but like, if you're not the networking layer, like, why are you throwing these exceptions to begin with?
Well, I mean, they could be a networking concept in a NuGet package. If some new TLS like thing, or somebody writes an onion resolver, right? Like, if they're throwing an invalid address exception, but there's no invalid address exception, like, them throwing new network exception directly means they're not actually participating in the future handlers when we add the new derived type. So yeah, I'd go ahead and make the constructor protected, and make the factory be the only way to make this level of the hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of these abstractions is so that people can implement ones that are not in box and kind of have them plug into various places. So we do want everyone else to be conforming to this exception model.
Yeah, I guess in your case it makes sense because you're treating this as an abstraction that you want other people to implement. In that case, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, and as long as there's the model of create it and, I am the unknown error type, here's my message, as long as you have that somewhere for someone who has a problem that they don't think can be represented with any described enum member, then I think you're good on that regard. But it allows for unification of future ones for if connection refused becomes a public type, or etc.
Okay. Can we define a public static create of network error method on this now and approve this?
I mean, it goes back to, like, what do you want to have? I mean, like, my understanding is you still want to decide which things to make exceptions for. So I'd rather you take it offline, modify the proposal for B, flesh it out, add a factory, and make the constructors that you want protected, and decide which derived types you want to have.
But first of all, we can always add derived types later, right? I mean, we could at least approve this as far as it goes, and then talk about if we want derived types and come back for approval on those later. Secondly, I'm not sure we are actually want to define any derived types. I think that, at least for now, if we've got the enum, that satisfies everything we want, and adding derived types is something we could consider in the future, but I don't think it's important enough for us to try and force something right now. Do you agree with that, Corey?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I essentially take what you have as the current public constructor. I would flip the enum and the message, and then make the message nullable, or make the message optional. Where what you really just want to say is, yep, I'm a network exception, connection refused. And that's what I expect your common path would be. If you think a custom message on each connection refused is what you would really expect, then feel free to disagree with me on that point.
No, I think that's fine, but we're still doing the factory methods, though, right?
Yeah.
So take this, flip those two args around, make it
But
protect
then
the
it
message,
doesn't-
and then have a factory.
Yeah, if we're doing the factory methods, then there's no public constructor, so it doesn't matter.
Right. It becomes a protect. Well, I mean, the constructor still
Okay,
needs a signature because it's protected.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
But the factory method, my gut is that you would want that people would be more likely to just say connection was refused and maybe here's an inner exception, and that providing a custom message seems less likely. And so that's why I would make the error be a mandatory argument and the message be optional.
Yes, makes sense.
So what is the order then? You would have error, inner exception, message, or you would have error, message, inner exception?
I guess what I just said, if I expect that it's going to be error with an inner exception and message is unlikely, means message would go last.
That's
So
what
that
I
you
was
could do
thinking.
error, comma, exception, and that's a successful compilation.
And it would be protected. And then where would the factory go?
I'd put it as
Network exception, public
create,
static.
yeah,
create.
static network exception create on network exception.
And it takes the enum value.
Enum value, comma, optional exception, comma, optional message.
Yep.
So same as the constructor.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the constructor could maybe take the message as a required thing, and the factory is the one that builds it.
That's true.
Like the constructor may be correct as is. And then just the factory would be the one that's error, comma, exception, comma, message.
Well, I can see a user wanting to get the default error message if they're deriving from network exception. So having message be nullable there might still be useful.
Fair enough.
Okay, so would have the same signature then. What about the enum? Are we happy with the enum? Any changes to the enum?
As a practical question, can you tell me the difference between socket error host not found and socket error host unreachable? One of those is DNS and the other is bind.
Host unreachable, I believe, is like you have no routes defined to get to actually reach that host. Like it's out of your network.
Yeah, so I don't know that I would call those one item instead of two, because one of those is, again, thinking from an application level, one of them is, I think you typed the wrong name in this box to connect to, or you have an error in your URL, and the other one is maybe you're in an isolated network, or maybe they're offline, or so since those are different problems you would want to surface, I wouldn't collapse those two. So maybe it would be add host unreachable.
The question here, I think, is, do we think that those conditions make sense for anyone other than sockets? I mean, it's...
Again, if you're thinking of something like, complicated protocols like Tor, right? Like invalid address could happen at complicated layers, which are different than the sockets. And I don't know how Tor actually works. So I don't know if there's a difference between hosts, not found, and I lost the routing in the middle and whatever. But these things, when I look at them, they feel generic, like, hey, something didn't work here, like, versus like a name lookup failed versus a connection failed versus etc. So
I feel like handling host unreachable might be a little of a stretch. I would even be okay saying that in our implementation today could just map to unknown with an inner exception specific to socket.
Fair enough. I'm just saying I wouldn't collapse unreachable into host not found.
I agree with that, yeah.
But I can believe, hey, you gave me a v6 address and I'm only a v4 NIC. Like, sure, no one cares. AF not supported versus I don't know what address not available means, but the things of like, this was gibberish at sort of the NIC level instead of the DNS level all feel like one big thing to me in the 99% case.
All right. Anything else? I wrote some notes at the bottom. Let me scroll down. We happy with that?
Let me take a look.
My only thought is if we make a derived exception, it would probably be something like connection aborted exception and not just aborted exception. So it might be good to have these called connection aborted and connection reset.
Sounds good.
That's fine.
Because then it's connection aborted, connection reset, connection refused, describing connection problems. And then address in use, invalid address, host not found, and other for things that aren't the connection.
All right.
Great. So is this approved, or do we need to come back with the factory spelled out?
I just marked it as approved.
Yeah,
Okay.
because you've got the factory there, and now bringing in other types probably is something we could even just do over email of, hey, we want to make, connection aborted exception, extends network exception as a thing we return from the factory now. We'll be like, great, ship it.
Makes sense.
All right. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Alrighty. So now we'll for the remaining hour, based on last meeting's success. So Jeremy missed out on a bunch of discussion, but I can summarize it where we landed. So let me scroll up a little bit. So basically, the problem goes like this, right? So and let me actually scroll back to the top. It's probably easier to explain this way. So what we have today is we have runtime information where we basically expose these APIs. And then as part of the guarding feature, we added these APIs here. The intent was to say, well, we basically use runtime information as the place to do OS checks, so we should put it there. The downside of that approach is that there's two issues. One of them is it's an interrupt services. The intent originally is interrupt services because, well, what do you check for the OS? Because you're going to p-invoke, which is not going to be the case for the majority of users who write guarding calls, because the idea is they call OS bindings, which are high-level APIs. Of course, the implementations of those will most likely use p-invokes, but the user doesn't have to know that. So if we force down everybody to have a using statement for interrupt services, they import a bunch of junk we don't want most people to use. So it seems like a bad decision to do that. So the proposal is to say, well, let's move these guys out of there, put them onto something that is not interrupt services. Then we can talk about where that place would be. But it generally seems like just doing a guard call should not loop in interrupt services. Then the proposal was to say, okay, let's move them on something like environment, because that's where people do OS checks today, which according to users information for OS version and runtime information, you can see how that differs. And clearly the priority is environment in this case. Environment has downsides too. Jan pointed this out in the comments as well, that it's kind of a dumping ground for a bunch of stuff that we added over the years. I don't think it's that bad, but like it certainly has this flavor, I guess. The other issue that we have of the original pattern is that we have string-based methods, because we wanted to mirror, or I should say I wanted to mirror effectively what you would have to write in an if check, what attribute is on the type, and the attribute on the type is a string. But that's a performance trap, because that means that every time you do a guard call, somebody has to parse that string. And the concern here is that if you guard in something like a hot loop or a hot path, that's not great for performance. So the idea is let's have overloads that split them out, so we actually take the platform name and the version as separate arguments, because then means there's no parsing. That will be these two methods here. But then people said, well, what you really want to write is you want to have strongly typed APIs. You don't want magic strings. So what people really want to have is basically helper methods per operating system, where you just say, is Android, or is Android version at least. And that's why we landed on this shape that you see right now. That was kind of the takeaway from last time. I'm still not in love with environment. I can live with environment, given that it's not too bad. It has like 20 members today, I think. And all of those here would be somewhat nicely grouped with the is prefix. The only other is methods we have are checking for architecture. And they are, I feel like, very related to, what thing are you running on right now, which is basically what these APIs all help to answer. So I don't think it's that bad. I mean, the naming conventions are a bit odd, thanks to the fact that we have lowercase, or I guess camel case platform names, but I don't know whether we feel strongly enough to fix that, but that's what we have. Now, if things get added in the future, I can totally see us adding more members here. I would generally defend this the approach to say, if we feel an operating system is important enough for us to add a member on OS platform, we should totally add the two methods here as well. And similar to OS platform, we have this primary APIs or fallback APIs where you can always write the code even though you don't have static methods for the operating system, because let's say you target a lower version of Net 5, for example, right? So that's pretty much it. So do people have any questions, comments, or?
Didn't there used to also be the greater than check?
Yeah, the greater than check. So the greater than
the-
check, I basically
whatever the other direction is.
Yeah, so we can't that because the argument was it's kind of redundant, and it cuts down the number of methods. I had it somewhere here. It was concluded that earlier than is necessary as is logic equivalent to say if environment is Windows and not is Windows version at least. And yes, it has this downside that people have to write conditional logic, and we know historically they suck at doing that. But I guess in this case it's defendable because if they get it wrong, they get it squiggly in the IDE. And if they invoke the fixer, well, the fixer will tell them what to do. We don't have the fixer yet. We'll probably not ship one in 5.0 either, but I guess that's the experience that we pursue long term. So I am personally okay with that because we tell people what the correct code is, and we tell them at compile time whether they got it right.
Right, and I guess that is the relationship we had before, which is that the boundary condition, like it was less than or greater than or equal to on one, and it was less than on the other, and
right.
So that's, they don't have to deal with the boundary case.
Right.
And I was trying to look back. I swear you had good rationale for why we needed the earlier than, because it wasn't just the inverse of.
No, it is the
the
so it's not just the inverse of this, because you also have to check whether you're on Windows.
Right. Given you've already checked you're on this OS family, then now it's just a not. The
I see.
Okay,
Okay, so
it was
the less.
both.
Okay, so the. Yeah, so you had less checks for Guardian with comparison. It's less than. Okay, so it was just a shorthand before, I guess, to do those two things combined.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, it is easy in the analyzer, right? So, like, the one thing that I haven't really looked into this yet, we can probably talk about this more, but my understanding is that the way these checks are exposed in the flow analysis is you don't see a compound check, right? What you end up seeing is you see one node that has multiple incoming arrows, and so each of those arrows basically has a label corresponding to all the conjunctions, right? And then you have different arrows coming in if you have disjunctions, right? So it might not be the most convenient form in the analyzer to check these things, but as somebody else pointed out, like, we should try to make it right.
So yeah, my gut here, since you called me out specifically, is having had the wonderfulness of missing the first half of this, is I know we generally don't like nested types, but if nested type calling is, because really we don't like instances of nested types, but if nested type calling is sensible in all of our important
Intrinsics.
languages, then I was gonna say in all languages, but I have literally no idea how you do anything in COBOL.net. But that maybe we want like environment.os and then ask these things, just so environment doesn't get itself too cluttered, and it focuses all of the things that are OS versus environment variables and command line arguments and things. But
we have system.operating system.
We have what?
System.operating system.
Yeah, that already exists. We could do that. I mean, the question is, how do you call the is Android equivalent, right? It would be weird to say operating system.android.is.
No. So
But, like-
I would put all these at like on operating system, just as static is Android version at least. I wouldn't make different subtypes for the different families. It's just making sure that environment doesn't, like, the other common thing for environment is get environment variable and just make it so that there's not so much clutter that you don't even see that there.
I mean, in all seriousness, I actually like the idea of the nested types to have basically one type per operating system, because that would group them nicely together. And it also solves the problem with the branding, because you would say, let's say it's on environment, you would say environment.tvOS dot whatever the check is, right? And then you always have periods in between. So
What is the check there, though?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, like, we would have to come up with a way to describe that. I don't know what that would be, but
I mean,
like,
I think
is
it fits
current
really,
OS.
I think it fits really nice into operating system, though. Operating system dot is Android.
yeah, I think that would be reasonable.
Yeah.
I feel like if I'm developing a library for .NET 5, I would probably want to use is.OS platform. Even if .NET 6 is out and it supports some other OS or platform to check on, I would still probably just target .NET 5 and use a string there.
Well, to be clear,
By
like,
having these derived
if we
types
do
would
our
be-
job right, like, you will have all mainline operating systems with 5.0, right? So the most likely operating systems that we target by 6 will already be supported, at least capability-wise, on 5.0, right? So I would add is Android, is iOS, is macOS, is tvOS in this release, so that
Is browser, like all the other ones too,
Yeah,
right?
like
All the ones that we have today on.
all the
OS
ones that you
plan.
see on screen right now. So basically, that's all the ones we know of that we want to support in by 6, right? So it's yes, there will be cases where you can't do that because, I don't know, we do some other fancy stuff that we haven't even thought about yet. But the expectation would be that mainline code would get away with statically typed calls, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What about having these just be some const strings somewhere rather than an is method?
You could. I mean, the argument that Levi had last time, which I kind of buy, is that it's just shorter. And it's also discoverable. The problem with string literals is also, like, you don't really get told where they are because you don't have a type to look for, right? It's like, well, does anybody have a const with a string somewhere? Like, you kind of have to wire this up. That's kind of why the strongly typed enum that we have of OS platform was nice. The problem with OS platform is that we put it interrupt services. So similar to runtime information, I don't want to loop this thing in for mainline checks. And I think the methods are just shorter to write. I think the nested types would be not too bad because you just insert a dot somewhere, but like it would be the same number of characters.
Actually, I think
what
we
would
could
be
probably make the is methods JIT intrinsics if we really wanted to at some point to reduce the code we're compiling. So maybe they're better anyway.
Yeah,
I mean,
what would be
depending on the
advantage,
flavors.
Corey? What would be the advantage, Corey, to the constant string approach? Like you would have either.
Oh, we
10
just
constant
wouldn't have all
strings.
these extra methods forwarding to another method. It would just be slightly cleaner in the code, but
Right. I mean, like,
Yeah.
certainly at the level that we would be building things differently here, we know we have a different system or a system private core lib for Windows and non-Windows. So all the other things would just say return. Like, we could make them say return false, and then the JIT's going to immediately fold any calls that they do because that'll be a const. It'll get promoted to const, and tiered JITting will just start dead code removing left and right if they're calling the methods and not passing in the string. The one where we're passing in the string means it needs to do logic. So there is value for having the non-argument ones, whether that be through operating system.macOS.is running or what. But yeah, because I think that this the moving things into a higher level is reasonable. I would possibly also just add the is OS platform unless we have a layering inversion problem. I don't remember if they're in the same assembly or not. I think they are.
They're not in the same assembly today.
In reality or in contracts?
both.
Okay.
It's in runtime information.
I thought runtime information was actually in core lib, but
We could move it down if necessary, though. That's not too bad.
I mean, if we're just doing that just so we have the accelerator, like, I wouldn't do it for that reason. If they were in the same assembly and we could do it, then that would be a nice transition point. But
We would still need the string one though, is the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should keep the string, but I like the use methods now.
So-
the string one's also the only way that you could support an OS that we haven't already talked about.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. That's why we'd need the string one. So you're saying we'd have the string one, the one with OS platform maybe is optional, and then the hard coded is XXX.
Right. I would do the, whether we like environment.os. whatever, or we put it as on the operating system class, which I don't know that I'd put it there because we're not answering any of the questions that the object answers. And
Yeah, it's just we already have it, and it seems like it's the best name type for this if we want to put it somewhere.
is.
And I mean, the only nice thing is I agree with you on the object one, but like if we
if we're not
promote
really
the static
using
shape,
any of the instance members on operating system, then maybe we just also go ahead and just mark them all obsolete. And
No, we are. Like the way we do the is version at least checks is we, at least today, is we go to environment.os version and then get the version off of that. So we are using that. That's how we implement the is version at least.
so operating system is what I was told by Jan is operating system dot version is fine. The platform ID is fucked.
Right. The platform ID is totally screwed. Like that can be obsoleted all day long.
But the version is fine, basically. So it seems like at least,
Okay.
I think we can squint and say we actually do use the type enough.
fair enough.
It's just that, we don't encourage it, right? So I think we would push people towards the static use because it does the version comparison for them,
Right.
and it does the correct OS check. That seems really reasonable. My question is still like, I like the nested types in principle, but I can't find a way to make it readable because it really reads like Yoda is talking when you say operating system.android.is or is current or is active, right?
I still don't understand what advantage of that is over operating system.is Android. It's just because nobody's been using operating system today.
No, it's just like it. So it's similar to the intrinsics, right? It gives you a hierarchy where it basically flattens the view. Basically, you don't expose like this. Basically, if we go with the is pattern for the method names, you expand all the methods into one type, right? Versus if you have a grouping in between, it removes some of the noise, and then basically once you understand how one of the types works, you know how all the types work, right? And then the last part is just the spelling is slightly less problematic because if you have operating system dot macOS with a lowercase m, it doesn't read quite as bad because you have to put a period in between. Like is macOS with like lowercase s next to lowercase m looks weird. Capitalizing m has other problems because that's why we haven't done it on runtime information either. Sorry, on OS platform either. But that's a naming the biggest downside. But maybe we don't care. Maybe we just capitalize the letters and move
Can you
on.
say the first one again? I missed the first point. I didn't fully grasp it.
So the first point is basically the if you look at the number of methods or members that operating system has, if you introduce basically one type operating system in between, you move the methods all down by one level, which now means the top level things on top of operating system is basically just one type per operating system rather than number of methods times operating system, right? So right now we only have two, but God forbid we ever add a third one. Which we might, right? I mean, like this is early, right? So like we think we get away with just having is version at least.
But we'd always have the is OS platform, the string.
The string one would still need to live on the base type, but
Right. But that's
instead of the ones that take string times the number of OSs we have accelerators for, it would be we have the number of string ones plus the number of OSs we have accelerators for.
yeah.
So it's a fan out instead of multiply.
Do we think that there's a legitimate hierarchy here that needs to be represented?
Well, it's basically
Versus just-
maybe hierarchy is the wrong word, but it's basically you group by area. Like you basically have one group per accelerator, right? You have Android, iOS, macOS, tvOS, watchOS, Windows, and then as I just demonstrated with browser FreeBSD and Linux, it doesn't make sense for version accelerators for those because they don't really have the notion of a version. But you don't have to see this, right? When you look at operating system, you just see top level entries for those.
FreeBSD does. FreeBSD has well-defined versions.
Well, then that's a bug in
There's
my
also a
spec.
great history of checking for specific browser versions.
Well, except that ours is not
this. It's
ours is
definitely
not
not this.
the browser, right? It's a browser, so that's why it doesn't have a version number really.
Yes, it's are you running .NET for browser instead of .NET for Firefox?
Right.
There's not a .NET for Firefox. There's a .NET for browser, and do you care about Firefox quirking? Yeah, I don't because right now adding. I mean, I agree on the brand casing that it would make, you would go to operating system .ios.is version at least and ask that question, but the one of just like, are you this OS at all? Yeah, it's a little backwards, but it might be okay.
So you would
I would
literally
go with
say if
is
operating
running
system dot windows dot is.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously need a, it is current is running. I mean, is current is weird because like, does that mean you have all your security updates installed? But like,
yeah, that's what I'm saying. To me, it's kind of like I
Because that
think
would be is
operating
current
system
platform.
dot is
I get,
FreeBSD
like
makes more sense.
it would be
than-
is current platform because it's a static accelerator for operating system .is OS platform Windows. So we would so it would either be is current platform or is OS platform.
Yeah, I mean the only thing we could do my biggest issue aesthetically with the current solution is the casing.
Yeah, it's a bit weird.
But like, I mean, we could do the weird thing. We could just say is the nested type, right? And then you would say operating system dot is dot FreeBSD.
No.
No, we don't like Fluent. Yeah, like I think operating system dot macOS dot is OS platform because again it's the same check as the higher type. We're just giving you the constant preloaded. So it's the same method. It reduces cognitive overloading.
Is it a method at that point, or is it a property?
I would still
we
make
can
it a
do
method.
either. It's
If
going to be a constant, but
if we expect it to be 01 all the time, then property is fine.
I guess it won't necessarily. Well, I guess it would be amortized 01 because even on a build that doesn't know if it's watch or TV or iOS, that it can't figure that out until runtime. It should only need to compute it once. So the CC-TOR would decide which of those three it is and answer that. But, yeah, I'm okay with either method or property.
Yeah.
Property might be cleaner, maybe. Just thinking of code if it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can also cheat. If the casing is the only one, we make it away with putting an underscore in between or something.
Yeah, I mean the real question here is as you said, do we expect more methods in the future? Because if we make these nested types and only ever end up with two members, then it'll feel a little silly.
Yeah.
And in particular, we're not like, are we going to add? Would we do operating system .linux .is OS platform as the property and not because we don't have a version thing for it? So does it get a type or does it just get a is on the parent operating system type?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think that if we put it on operating system, I think I don't actually care how many there is because I mean, realistically, that list, like, the list of platforms will never be like 200, right? It will be like, let's be generous and say 20 or 30, right? And having 60 members on a type is not like, the world is ending.
Right. But on environment, I would think it's weird that there's
Yeah.
60 members for asking OS version questions, and then
Right.
the what's my current working directory and go find this environment variable are sort of just buried next to that.
So maybe if you put it, it's like similar to UI controls, right? If you go to, let's say, text box in WinForms, right, you will probably have 60 methods easily, right? Because there's like a property for freaking everything, right? So and it's generally not a problem. I mean, it's that's just what the type is for, right? And I think here it's the same thing. If we say operating system is just for checking operating systems, it makes sense if it lists everything we have supported, right? So and then over time, if things just get out of fashion because we dropped support for it, let's say in some hypothetical future world, we stop caring about Windows entirely, maybe then we just editor browser will hide Windows and say like, yep, the API existed in the past, but the operating system is no longer supported, so there's no point of asking those questions. And that, I think, is reasonable, right? And then we would, I think the type would be still very usable. And then the only issue that we still have is the mixing case thing, and maybe we just suck it up and put an underscore in those cases. Let's say it's not going to be pretty, but it's going to be readable.
Yeah.
What's the problem with not going with the branding and capitalizing the first character? Because that's how we do it in .NET.
So try this for iOS. Like, do you recognize iOS if you do this?
Is iOS.
Because iOS is now 3 all caps, right?
Yeah, that's how OS X is today. Granted, that's how it's branded, but
OS X was branded as all cap letters.
Right. That's what I said. Granted, it was branded that way, but today we have OSPlatform.OSX 3 capital.
So how would we capitalize in iOS? You would say it's 3 all caps, or it's capital I lowercase os?
3 all caps, I think. Is it only iOS that's the real problem because there's only one character? Because like tvOS, watchOS, macOS.
They look. Yeah, looking at them right now with the brand casing, is they look like somebody just forgot to hit shift.
Yeah, even with the OS one, it's kind of shitty because you have OS version at least, so it's not. It's not as bad as iOS, but like it's still not great. But yeah, it is what it is. I think I can live with capitalizing the first letter.
It would definitely look better than underscores, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least it would feel like .NET more than underscores.
Yeah. The problem is like, so here's the next question. Like, are we doing anything for runtime for OS platform then, or are we just completely canning that?
Honestly, like that was my thing last week, right? Is that I think if we're going this route, I think runtime information at least has to be on the plan to be obsoleted.
Yeah, so like basically, well, last time I talked only about this one. I'm talking about OS platform. It's kind of next to it, so you could say it's related, but
it would be obsoleted as well in my mind. Like that was just wrong.
Okay with that. Jeremy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess because if we're already if all the types that we're going to have statically known about in OS platform are already going to be represented here, then there's probably not more value or not a lot of value left in that strongly typed string, which may mean that we deprecate it in favor of this one. Obsoleting it is probably painful because it's a net standard 2 type.
Yeah, obsoleting, like, let's take obsoleting kind of like on the side for a second. Let's just first decide, are we stopping evolving that? Because, so first thing is we added a bunch of members to OS platform, specifically the ones that are listed here as well, like Android, iOS, macOS, tvOS, watchOS, browser. And so if we basically say we put these as helper methods on operating system, I would actually go in and delete the members from OS platform.
Agreed. Just Alexander said that as well, right? He
Yeah.
gave that feedback.
Yeah, I don't. How long ago did we add them?
Literally like a month ago, Probably less than
Okay.
that.
Okay, because if I was gonna say if they've been there for all of the 5 previews, then I would just say we just maybe don't add new things anymore. But if we just added them, then nobody's already written checks for them, so it won't be a painful upgrade.
I mean, it has been in a few previews, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, do we burn .NET 5 because we made a mistake early in .NET 5?
I think it just shows it like they're the last wave that we entered for the transition period. It's .NET
Yeah.
5 is symmetric across the 2 things. .NET 6 forward environment, or sorry, operating system is the only place we put things.
I mean, the only thing is now also like we added them in the wrong casing here. So I would align the casing between those and operating system. It seems weird to me that we have lowercase I, capital OS, but then on actually operating system we have, all caps iOS.
I think it's different. It's the whether or not it was the first letter, which is usually where branding gets. I mean, that's where Apple's branding gets weird as far as .NET names are concerned.
How do they solve this on their what does Next Step do? How do they solve this? They don't have these things.
I don't know, because I don't remember the.
I can't even find the API documentation. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. iPad OS. Yeah, I don't know. Xamarin guys could probably tell us, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with it. Like it seems like it's a. I mean, I like the stake in the ground to say if it's the first thing in a member, sure we can keep the lowercase one. If there's other words in front of it, we capitalize it because otherwise nobody can read it. That seems to me like a defensible position.
So I added what Swift does in the chat. It says if pound available, paren, and then small iOS, like iOS, like it's branded, small I, capital O, capital S.
Yeah, because they have the convenience that it's
part of the language in this world.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like foundation version is NS foundation version number _ iOS _ 6 _ 1. That's how they did all their pound defines. So as you suggested, Emo, it was an underscore to indicate why there's a lowercase letter here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would leave the OS version as brand casing because we can, and then do Pascal conversion here because readability.
Right.
See, I would remove the OS version, the OS platform ones. I just think like, we added them. We're going to a different direction.
Sorry. If we think that they've existed for a short enough time that people haven't already started using them in this preview, but given that we're like at the end of the release, I would say it would be fine for both of them to be represented if we had done it like for the first preview of 5. I would say don't remove it now. It's not worth the breaking change to upgrade. Of the wonderful people who try our stuff before it goes public or before it goes RTM.
Yeah, I don't think we landed it until preview 7.
Yeah, I think it was very recent. I mean, like that's why I think it's fine to yank them out. The thing is with yanking out though, like, so I think we can say if we yank them out, we yank them out. If we leave them in, we leave them in with the casing they have. Otherwise, it also kind of defeats the point of leaving them in, because it would be for compatibility. And if you change the casing, they would break that too. So I think that seems like a reasonable middle ground. So then I think the conclusion is let's try to yank it out and see whether we can pull that off. And then we would say we would not put it on environment, we put it on system, operating system as static members. And are we happy with the shape that I proposed? So basically,
So what you have on screen, but environment becomes operating system, and we Pascalify all the.
yeah, I moved
Brand.
FreeBSD to the accelerators with version checks. We would have is FreeBSD and is FreeBSD version at least. We would not have it for browser and Linux. And make iOS, macOS, tvOS, watchOS capitalize the first letter.
So going back to the platform compat with hierarchy or whatever, do we expect that anyone should want to check is Ubuntu 2004, or do we think that really they're just only likely to ask the generic Linux question?
No, I think they might. I mean, the question is, how would that work? I think we could decide that we make that work already by, if you ask on Ubuntu and you use the string Ubuntu, we could say the is OS platform version at least would give you the correct answer. And then we could expose the accelerator as well. It's just nobody has
We don't
asked
have
for
that
that.
I
today.
feel like, isn't that missing how Linux works though? I mean, I feel like this should check the kernel version, and
Well, that's if it
everything
was
else should
Linux
be like library
version.
checks.
Yeah.
No, but
It
that's
should
what
be
I'm
checking for like
th-
Ubuntu releases.
So I think there's two sides here, right? So there's the version checks only make sense when the thing you're testing is actually versioned by a single party, right? So like I think, for example, POSIX, you could argue, well, it's basically asking which version of POSIX does the current operating system support, right? Which part of the spec do you implement, right? You could say the same thing about the Linux kernel, but are people actually making any reasonable decisions based on those answers? Probably not, which is why leaving them out seems reasonable. But I think it makes sense to say if there is a Linux distro, Red Hat, Ubuntu, I don't know what else is there, like SUSE when it still existed. They are similar to Windows, right? They are released by one party, they are versioned by one party. So Ubuntu 18.04 is a very well-defined thing, and you can say, well, are you 18.04 or not, right? And I think that seems reasonable, but because you can actually make assumptions about the operating system at that point. If I know they run this version of the kernel, like, yeah, I may know which kernel APIs to call, but the vast majority of problems that we've tried to solve here is in user land. And so, like, what do you know about the user mode? What version of OpenSSL they're running if you know the Linux kernel version? Like, there's not much you can do with that.
I think the modularity of packaging systems on Linux makes it so that there's really no assumption you could make by saying I have this version of Ubuntu.
I mean, if you have Ubuntu 2004, you can assume that OpenSSL 1.1 is installed, because even though there's a side-by-side package for 1.0, that's going to be the default in their system. But
but
I'm
way
fine with
we're
leaving
doing
them out.
checks-
I'm just making sure we've thought of the problem.
the way we're doing checks here is like, is version at least, not is it 2004, right? And Ubuntu loves breaking changes between LTS versions.
Fair enough. I guess, yes, on that one, knowing that it's 2004 tells you you're newer than something, but you don't know that you haven't been broken by something else. So,
Well, that's
Because you might be on 2204, and now it has OpenSSL 1.3 next. Yeah.
I mean, but we need to be careful when we say breaking changes, right? So like iOS also does breaking changes, but they don't make ABI breaking changes, right? So like you can, and that allows us to actually make decisions with is version or at least because we ship an accumulative SDK. So we know
but
when
since
API.
you made the mistake of saying OpenSSL, they had breaking changes in their API and ABI between 1.0, 1.1, and 3.0,
Right.
which for Ubuntu is 16.04, 18.04, and 22.04.
Yeah, to me, this kind of, so I think that's the other reason why I think Jan has always said, like, you need to be able to ask for the actual version number as well, because sometimes you have to fingerprint and say, like, I know this version of the operating system, not a later version, but this particular version has this behavior that I have to somehow, recognize and quirk, right? And sometimes you get away with, actually checking for, load library, can I actually load the library or whatever, right? But sometimes you literally have to like use an OS check. But it seems to me we would be handling those cases by saying we have generic query APIs for any operating system, and I think it's reasonable for Ubuntu and Red Hat to respond to Red Hat plus version number or Ubuntu plus version number.
Yep.
And then say like on the OS version, you get the actual operating system version as reported by whatever you name or Win32 APIs. But those are not the mainline scenarios. We expect mainline scenarios to be going with accelerators because those have generally well-defined behavior, and you generally avoid all the the craziness that is package managers and breaking changes from the operating system.
I will just add, given that we're putting all these static things on operating system, and you just mentioned that sometimes it's useful to get the exact version, which is being reported from operating system. That's an instance property that I don't see how you're supposed to get it. So would we want to add a current version and current version string static accelerator on the type?
We
You
could
get it by environment. You say
Yeah.
environment.os version,
yeah.
and that gives you an operating system.
Okay. As long as we have the path. But it's just, if everything else on it looks like statics are the way forward, should we add static accelerators for those two things, a version and version string? I'm okay with no. I'm just asking the question.
I mean, I guess I wouldn't, but I get your point. Just because, I mean, since it's been since like .NET 1.0, right?
Yeah.
That environment.os version.
I mean, I would generally say I would not move it here simply because if you have it, people will use it, but we generally don't want them to use it, right? We generally want people to use these accelerators because of the open-ended checkness. And we can't change environment, so I would just, of course, leave it there and then say, if you really need to do something crazy because you're part of the BCL team or you're just, some crazy interrupt guy, then by all means do it. You can, but, read the fine print.
Right. So we make the convenient things for, am I this OS family, and am I at least this version, because that's the essentially feature detection. And then if you really care about also doing the upper bound, you can either add the static not, or you can just read the version property yourself.
Yep.
Which you have to do a little bit more work for, but that's okay because it's possible. It doesn't need to be easy. All right, that's seems sound.
So then,
One other question is, does the analyzer respect both runtime information and these?
sorry, it does recognize which ones,
The new methods that we're proposing,
right?
operating system dot is Android.
Yep.
Obviously, it respects that.
Yep.
Does it also respect runtime information dot is Windows?
Yes, it should. And the reason I said it is for existing code, because that's the same reason why we relaxed the rules earlier for Windows, right? To say it should be okay to put an attribute on the method without a version number because it means 0.0.
So maybe another good to put to remove the new ones as well, maybe to make
the
it analyzers like a little. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think the analyzer will be written generically, so it probably wouldn't matter. But like, yeah. I
mean, this part, it can't be written generically, right? Like, this is the part that it's like, which OS is it on?
Well, I mean, the way I would write is I would just say like this, is the type operating system, is the method starting with is, or whatever the string comes after is the operating system, right? Except for the version at least. Right? Like that's, and then you just compare the strings. Similar to how you would say, well, if is the ini member you pass to is OS platform, you take that string of that member name and you just say it's a compare ordinal to whatever the project settings were, right?
Yeah,
so in that sense, you support all of them if you support one of them, right? Like it's kind of
right. Except we're not doing ordinal once we Pascal case the methods.
Well, sorry,
we weren't doing
ordinal
ordinal
case.
before either. We weren't doing ordinal before either because Windows was lowercase in the attribute and uppercase and
Yeah, we would do. So I meant ordinal ignore case, but like.
Fair enough.
But and I think we have some special handling to say macOS and OS X are considered the same. for compatibility reasons with the past. But like, yeah, those are the kind of things that are.
Booyah's trying to say something. Booyah, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, I just said there can be many other methods. Starting with is I would just string comparison for the methods, I guess, because just accept.
Okay.
I'll have the string of the method names.
Cool. So then, I think this covered all the controversial parts from last time.
Yep. And then we also the methods that we're removing, the is version at least, that we're removing off runtime information. Again, we feel comfortable with that being not. I mean, it is a breaking change for anyone who called it, but we don't feel that it will be too disturbing for our preview users. Like, it's not like everybody's writing these checks in every method they write. So,
I mean, and the other thing is we don't have Xamarin in 5.0 yet either, right? Like, so there's not a ton of people who are using. They might be using the browser one for Blazor, but honestly, who's using 5.0 and iOS? Nobody, right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud of making sure that we're not punishing people for using previews by moving something at the last minute. I know we reserve the right to. I'm just making sure that we're comfortable with the decision. I think we are. I'm just asking it to make sure the emo really feels that way.
Well, I mean, I feel this way by process, right? I mean, I think I like the direction. I mean, I see the downsides of it too, but like I think the positives outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a thing that essentially everybody who was using 5 already would be doing, and we had added it in the first preview, then I would think that it might be too disruptive to move it now. If we were entirely removing it because we thought it was a bad feature, that would be a different argument. But yeah, I think that we're probably good doing it. I'm just making sure that we understand the risk reward of moving it at this time.
I honestly think the only risk we realistically have is like building our own stack. Somebody will probably have at least use one of them somewhere.
Right.
But that's a normal build break. I don't think the vault will end when we do that, and it's a pretty straightforward thing. And then yeah, for customers, we generally tell them like previews are previews. I mean, the whole point of shipping them is to react to customer feedback.
Indeed.
And this one's we haven't really advertised, so I would be shocked if lots of usage is there. So the only open thing that we still probably want to talk about at least quickly is the attributes. So we talked about this last time. So originally my proposal is to put them all in system runtime.versioning. Then Eric said he wants to have them basically where the methods are, and the methods were basically interrupt services, so we proposed to move them there. Then we said, well, like that's all not great. Let's move them then to system. And then I said, well, we don't want to move too much shit into system either. So basically the compromise we landed in was to say we will put the attributes that people are expected to apply in system, which would be 3, not the 2 here. It would be supported, unsupported, and obsoleted in. And then we would move the target platform attribute and the OS platform attribute, the abstract base type in system runtime versioning, because those ones nobody cares about, right? This one only exists in the docs so that you can click on them. And you generally don't click on the namespace. You click on, let's say, unsupported. You see the base type as OS platform. You click on that one, and you see the derived type. So the namespace there doesn't really matter too much. And then target platform attribute is the same thing. It's like it's applied to the assembly automatically. You basically never use it unless you open the thing in ILSpy. You just see that, oh, target platform was Windows, cool. That's basically the only reason why we have it. So I think those 3 make sense to me in versioning, and then those make sense in system. It's sad that we had 3 more types to system, but so be it. Any concerns with that?
It sounds reasonable. I know that we didn't. So just saying the alternative. Part of why we moved the things out of runtime versioning was because anyone using the attributes was also going to be calling the methods, basically. Right. But do we think that calling the method means you're using the attribute?
Sort of. So there's 2 sides to it, right? I think it's okay to have a using statement if you use the attribute because auto completion and stuff. So I don't think it would be terrible if you would leave them in runtime versioning. It would be terrible to use them in interop services, right? But that's already taken care of by moving the methods out of there. But realistically, when you build an iOS app, what will happen is that there's this super strong pull from Apple on the latest stuff all the time. But practically speaking, you will have to target all the operating systems. So that means you will most likely have to write if statements, in various areas of your code base. But as Eric observed, like when you do that, you're also very likely writing helper methods or, even helper types to deal with newer features that Apple shipped. And at that point, you really want to forward the checks to your callers to say like, oh, this is my helper for some fancy new API, and that only works when you're running on iOS 12 or higher. So I will basically just forward the checks to my callers, but instead of them calling 20 methods, they only have to call maybe one method or instantiate one type and call a method. And so in that sense, you will very likely end up having to mark your own stuff with these attributes. And so yes, I think there will be, maybe not every single time you do it, but I don't know, at least 50-60% of the cases you will probably end up marking some part of your code.
Okay. Then adding the 3 into system seems probably justified.
Yeah, we thought about other namespaces.
I certainly wouldn't say add all 6 to system. My question was, can we move them all back to system runtime versioning? But if you think it's going to be common enough that you're going to do both, then sure, let's.
System runtime versioning is relatively clean namespace. It has like 5 types in them, so doing that wouldn't be bad. But we have to understand that effectively that now means if you're doing iOS development, virtually large chunks of your code base will have a using for that namespace, which might be okay, right? The same with networking and other stuff. But Eric didn't like the name. I think it's not too bad because it's not really how the runtime itself is versioned. It's more like what features does the runtime offer for versioning. That's how I read the name. And then I think it's fine to have OS platform stuff in there. I think it's not too bad to have them there from the IntelliSense standpoint. It will autocomplete anyways. And in many cases, people will use the code fixer, once we have it. So I don't think it would matter too much, but I do see the argument for, operating system is in system. It seems to me sense to say we have OS platform in there as well.
Yeah. Personally, I have a slight preference for putting all 6 types in system runtime versioning, but if anyone wants to say, well, the 3 you use should really be in system to be next to operating system, then I'll say okay.
It's 5. Does it change?
I'm 5140.
It's only 5 types. Does it help?
So I'm 5149 to put all the attributes in runtime versioning. I'm 100% that the 3 that people aren't going to use should go in versioning.
The 2.
So, what? Yeah, sure. 2, 3, whatever. The target platform and the
OS platform, yeah.
Yeah. Those should be out of the way there, or those should not go into system. The 3 that people use, if we want to avoid cluttering system, having them be in system runtime versioning is fine. You can always avoid the using statement and explicitly qualify your attributes.
Right.
But and I don't think it would be terrible for them to be mixed in that case, because the problem before was going to be you need a using for interop services and for versioning. You probably already have a using for system. You can not have one, but you probably already have one. So we're not adding 2 namespaces to solve the problem. We're adding 1 namespace to solve the problem. And to me, that's okay. That's why I have a slight preference to putting all the attributes in runtime versioning now that the check exists in system.
Yeah. Eric, how strong do you feel?
I had a stronger opinion when it was runtime information. And so then everybody needed to import 2 usings, right? They always had to import interop services and runtime.versioning.
Right.
I think I definitely know that my strongness here is getting less. that we move the checks into environment, and then if you want to use the attributes, one more using
now.
Right. And you're probably with the IDE type completion adding the namespace automatically. So if I was to do it, I like the symmetry and they're together, right? If this is important enough to go into, well, it used to be environment, but now system.operating system, then it's like, well, the attributes that go with it fit there. Like, I just like that symmetry, but if we really want to put them all in the new namespace, the runtime versioning, I think that's fine too.
Yeah, so then let me make a proposal here, because we very rarely have the problem that we put something in system and that we didn't put something in system and afterwards wish we had, but we very often have the reverse problem. So unless we feel super strongly they should go in system, I would say let's put them in versioning, because system is not the namespace that needs more types. And I think that's, given that versioning is a relatively clean namespace and doesn't really pollute your IntelliSense if you import it, I think that seems like a fine compromise.
What more stuff would we start putting in system runtime versioning? Like, now that, before it was literally stuff that was only about the .NET framework version. Now that we're starting with like, oh, this API supported on this operating system. What else,
I think stuff like that. I think like anything that is like declarative attributes or facilities to read data about versioning, right? Whether it's OS platform. I mean, I could imagine if you ever have RID-based query APIs that would, or with, maybe not query APIs, but like, any sort of things that encapsulate RID's logics in some way might go there, like stuff like that. So it will be always very much like I don't think this namespace will ever see a lot of APIs, because if we do our job, there shouldn't be that many facilities to begin with.
But like things that are like version is a high importance to it.
Yes.
Whether it's operating system version or some library version or whatever.
Right.
Okay. I'm not, like I said, I was pretty strongly opposed when it was in 2 different namespaces. Now, since this is moving into system, I'm less opposed. So I'm fine. I think I'm fine with.
All right. All the attributes, system runtime versioning, or system runtime version, whatever it is, and the methods move to statics on the operating system class.
I do want to kind of just hammer again on the runtime information plan about like what is our Uber plan with that thing, because we did add like the runtime identifier to it in 5.0, right? This is how you get the RID of the current machine. Like, are we saying, is our plan of record runtime information is basically no more, we're not making any more investment in it?
Yeah, I would say that's
maybe
only
someday
true. I mean, I would say like, there's some things on it that we don't have anywhere else, right? We have these diagnostic strings, for example. I mean, unless there's a super strong need why they need to move somewhere else, I wouldn't go out of my way to move them somewhere else just so I can deprecate the type. I'm personally okay with saying the plan is we don't add to it. And if there's still stuff that is, in some edge case necessary to be used, I'm okay if they keep using that thing. But like,
basically, is OS platform is more or less deprecated on that thing.
Yeah, is OS platform we should probably kill. We should probably say this is no longer necessary.
Because we're not adding new things to OS platform.
Right.
But the other things like process architecture, the description, OS architecture, and RID, those are the 3: architecture, descriptions, and then RID.
Right.
Those are the 3 things that are left on it.
And RID, for example, I'm okay right now with being on that thing too, because that is clearly interop, right? Like you clearly do that in the case where you do interop. So that's why I'm thinking like, I'm okay with just saying we don't add to this type unless it's clearly interop. But I think generally speaking, OS checks or anything we expect mainline developers to do shouldn't go on that type.
Okay, I think that plan's fine then. It's just basically we virtual obsolete is OS platform in 5.0.
Yeah.
Okay. That solves my concern. So we doing this? This is our 5.0 plan?
This seems to be the 5.0 plan. Let me just post the comments what I have. We agree to move all attributes to system.runtime.versioning. Okay, so what? Okay. What else did we decide? I think that's pretty much it. Oh yeah. We have decided to move all members to operating system, which doesn't expose any statics today. Okay, so I think this is it. Let me copy paste this all over. So tell me whether that's echoes what you think I said, or what we all thought we decided.
Did you forget to scroll?
No, I did not, but maybe if Teams is frozen again.
No, this is the same thing that happened last week where your broadcast internally has stopped.
Okay.
Let me try
Yeah, I
this
still
again.
see starting with current thinking is this. Okay, technically the bullet before that, but
Okay, let me hang up the Teams call for a second and come back in. All right, friends, now it's just me and you. Nobody else from my team is on the call because I closed Teams and the hope that it will solve my sharing issue with the team. Let's try this again. Join. Isn't that fun?
He's back.
as far as I can tell, he never left.
All right, so we ran into a problem. Try again in a few minutes. Are you guys still there? Nope. Out of the call again. Hello, my friends. Can you hear me?
Yes, can't see you, but we can hear you.
Hello, Emil.
Here
And now we can see you.
Now I see new notes. And
Perfect.
TVOS is capitalized.
Weird. All right.
Yeah, I mean, the third bullet would be the new members from OS platform.
Yeah.
We're only introducing a preview breaking change, not a major version breaking change. But yep.
All right, then that's what it is. And then this is the actual versions namespace now. We have OS platform, target platform, unchanged, supported, unsupported, obsoleted, and then these tries you try to delete.
Mm-hmm. And don't want to rehash too much of previous things, but we decided platform name was sufficient, even though it's actually a versioned name.
On the attributes, yeah, we went back and forth on this one. Like I personally stopped caring, honestly, because it's kind of depends on your viewpoint, I guess, because in the project file we call it target framework and then has a version number in it, right? So I think name is fine, but like I also don't feel super strongly. I mean, we could call it moniker, but then it's also like moniker is just a fancy way to say name, so.
Yep, that's fine. I'm just making sure that was where we landed and that you're not rewriting history by just copying and pasting what you wanted to.
No, it's like yeah. I mean, the other question is like, is OS platform the right suffix now in those things?
It's still the name of the check that we had. We're not using the accelerator type, but I mean, it's possible that the feedback that we'll get from later is that the people who are using the strings, they may still want the strongly typed string, and we may end up moving OS platform to system run or system private core lib just to help out with that, and then it all still makes sense. But I wouldn't do that as part of this release.
Yeah,
that would be the only if people are asking for it.
Right, I can live with that too. All right, so then let's say this is it. Let me approve this guy, and then we made some good progress.
I got through 2 controversials.
Somebody in chat is suggested the idea is computer. Operating system, Android is computer. That means similar to is. All right, so then this is it for today. And then I see you on Thursday, I think, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah, that is only Tuesday.
Sounds good.
Happy Tuesday, everyone.
To you too.
Bye.